Hi, I'm Sister Michelle, the coordinator for the Life Skills for Mission program. And today we're going to hear about spiritual direction. In some countries, it's called spiritual mentorship, but this concept of spiritual direction. And our guest speaker today is Sister Joyce Diltz from the American Province. And we're going to do a bit of an interview. So, Sister Joyce.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you in this way. Just for a little background about myself, I've been a poor handmaid celebrating my 55th anniversary of profession this year. I've been doing spiritual direction for 47 years. I went to Creighton University and did training to become a spiritual director there. I later got a Doctor of Ministry degree in spiritual direction as well. So I've been doing spiritual direction and individually directed retreats for a long time and have lots of good experience accompanying people in that way.
Well, that is a great intro, and it leads us right into my first question is there, tell us about spiritual direction and is there some history of it? Help us to understand what is spiritual direction, and you take it from there.
Okay, so spiritual direction by definition is a process, conversation, usually between two people, to talk about God's presence and action in one person's life. So if we talk about the spiritual director as the director, though the Holy Spirit truly is the director, and we talk about the person who comes for direction as the directee. So spiritual direction is a conversation between director and directee to walk with the directee in an effort to see how God is present in his or her life and what God's invitations are. So that's really what it is. The spiritual director is someone who is very familiar with the spiritual life and who has training to accompany others in the spiritual life. So that's an important element. Not just everyone and not just every holy person is a spiritual director. In terms of history, I think it began in the church first with the hermits in the desert back in the early centuries, and people would go out and seek wisdom from these hermits, and that was probably the first form of direction. Except that I think also of a story in the gospel where the rich young man comes to Jesus and says, "Tell me what I must do to reach the kingdom of heaven." And so Jesus gives him an answer. In a way, that was spiritual direction. But today we would not think of it as giving answers. We would think of it as helping the person to discover the answers within themselves. So it's a process of sifting through what's happening, how am I feeling, what goes on inside the inner life, and sifting through that to become clearer about where is God moving in all this and what is God inviting me to. Besides the desert, in terms of history, in the Middle Ages, spiritual direction existed pretty much in monasteries. I think for the most part, it was available to religious and to people in formation in religious life. In our poor handmaid experience, it has become available after a while. Actually, when I was a novice, we did not really have spiritual direction. It's pretty much only after Vatican II that spiritual direction has become much more available to people, and that there's been training for people to become spiritual directors. And the gift of Vatican II is telling us that the Holy Spirit is within each of us, and we need to learn to listen to the Spirit's guidance. And so today there are quite a few training programs to train people to help others listen to the Spirit's guidance. So that's a brief history.
Well, that's great. Thank you. We'll have to come back to that question of hearing the Spirit's guidance and knowing the difference between whether it's just what we want to do or if this is God moving in our lives. Always a point of discernment, huh? So in some countries, they use the concept of spiritual mentor and others spiritual director. So do you have any clarifying perspective on that, the difference there?
Well, I'm not really familiar with spiritual mentoring in other cultures. I would say I could speak from our culture in America. A mentor would be someone who kind of shows you the way and coaches you and shares wisdom. Um, I don't know if that's what other cultures mean by spiritual mentor or not. I would see that though as different from spiritual direction, because spiritual director is not one who gives guidance even or gives advice, but again helps the person discover her own wisdom and the Holy Spirit within herself and in the movements in her life.
Okay. So let's go with that concept of that discernment. How do we know in spiritual direction whether it's the Spirit moving in our lives or if it's our own personal will? How does one kind of help figure that out? Or is that the role of the spiritual director?
That's an important role of the spiritual director, yes. How it happens, again, it's helping the directee, the one who comes for direction, to look at her experiences, her motives, what she feels, where do those feelings come from, where do they lead. So it's an ongoing conversation to try to uncover what's really at the root of my desires and my fears, and how does God lead in all that. Very personal, very unique person.
You know, that's a really good question, a good point. That is a very personal thing. Sometimes in spiritual direction, you might be revealing an awful lot about, or a person might be revealing an awful lot about his or her own background, etc. What is the difference between spiritual direction then and counseling? Um, because those could be confused.
Um, I think one way to think about counseling is that it is problem oriented. So if there's an issue or a problem, a trauma perhaps, that someone really wants to work with and needs help with, that would be pertinent for counseling. So counseling is a problem solving process in one sense. It's I come with a problem and I want help learning to live with this problem and to find a solution for it in my life. Spiritual direction is not problem centered, it's always God centered. And we may talk about some of our problems and some of our struggles in direction, but it's always to the end of, so what is God inviting me to here? How is God present in this struggle that I'm in? Does that make sense?
It certainly does make sense. And so could a person be having a spiritual director on a monthly basis or so, and then also be in counseling at the same time?
Yes, that's very possible. I've had the experience working with people in spiritual direction who somehow they kind of come in and tell the same story every time, and we kind of don't get anywhere. And when several times when that person has decided to get into counseling for the issue that we keep talking about, suddenly movement starts happening in spiritual direction as well. So it can be very helpful sometimes to be in both at the same time. It's always important to let your counselor know that you're in spiritual direction as well. And probably vice versa, to let the spiritual director know that as well, so that they're not working at cross purposes at all.
Great. How does one go about finding a spiritual director? What are the avenues? What are the possibilities?
So that's a really important question, I think. So I can talk about first, I guess, in the United States. You would want to look for someone who you know has training and who you feel comfortable with. So I would say that's also true for other countries and cultures as well. You want to find a person who you feel comfortable with, and you want that person to be trained. St. Teresa of Avila had a lot of spiritual directors. She tried one after another, trying to find somebody to help her with the experiences she was having in prayer. And she ended up saying, I don't want just a holy person. I want a learned person, somebody who knows the spiritual life.
Mm.
So I think one way to find a spiritual director is to look at retreat houses. Is there someone there, several people maybe, who might be
That's good.
possibilities? If you have someone in your own community who is trained as a spiritual director, or if perhaps there's a diocesan list of spiritual directors, that's a possibility. Perhaps even your province or unit has a list of people who would be good for spiritual direction. Once you find a possible person, have a little conversation ahead of time where you just ask a few questions. Partly you're wanting to get at some information, like where were you trained and kind of what's your approach in spiritual direction. But you also want to be feeling out underneath the conversation. Do I feel comfortable with this person? Can I trust this person with my story, with my life? I think as we're talking about this cross-cultural program in our congregation, it might be possible also to find a spiritual director in another province or region than your own. We have this wonderful thing called Zoom now that lets us be present to each other electronically across the world. So it's also possible, I think, to look for a spiritual director in another province or region.
Uh-huh.
And again, for people not familiar, it probably would be good to have a list of possible people available that you could interview to see who you feel comfortable with.
When you talk about that interview, you're talking like, is that a phone conversation? Is that a short Zoom conversation? And how do you let the person know that you're searching, or what's that conversation? What's that language you use?
So yes, short Zoom conversation or phone conversation. And you would just say, I'm looking for a spiritual director and I wonder if I could ask you a couple of questions. Like where were you trained? What approach do you use? What do you charge per session? How often would you expect to meet? Those kind of questions. And say right away, I'm looking for somebody. I want to know a little bit about you. And you might say, I'm also looking at a couple other people and I want to decide who will be the best fit for me.
Oh, the best fit is a good way to go, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So give me a little sense, if you would, for spiritual direction, when you say what is the fee, or what is the suggested fee or something, what does that kind of look like?
The fee?
Yes, yes, the fee.
Well, again, I can only speak from the US culture for this really, but we tend to offer a range. And so like, I can just tell you what I do. I offer, say, like $40 to $60 a session and ask people to do what they can within that range. So I get a variety of amounts. But I also always say that, if this is a difficulty for you, that I'm happy to talk about what you could afford. Good. So certainly in terms of poor handmaids, we're never just looking to make money. That you don't do that as a spiritual director. But payment is a way of honoring people's education in this field. And it's also a way of reminding the directee that this is not just a casual conversation, or it's not just a friendly visit. It really is a professional conversation. And the payment helps to keep that clear in a sense.
Okay. And the issue of confidentiality, that's just automatically there. So could you speak up just a little bit about the confidentiality piece of it?
Sure. It's very much, I think, like the confidentiality of going to confession. When someone comes for spiritual direction, that conversation is between us. And we would never violate, what you have shared or tell your story to someone else. It's very sacred in the conversation that we have. Now, there's always, I guess, the little exception to that, that is if we hear that someone is going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, then we have to take action to try to protect people. But apart from that, there's never any telling of your story to someone else.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's reassuring, because what you want in spiritual direction is the directee to really be as open and as honest as she can be in this case, our sisters, etc. We wanted this to be a short kind of synopsis of what is spiritual direction. So, Sister Joyce, do you have anything else you want to offer to us at all that we didn't cover in this interview?
Well, I would just encourage people, if you don't have a spiritual director, look for one. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift in our life as women religious. It really helps us stay focused on our life with God and helps keep us honest, keeps our ministry rooted in God and our life with God, helps us not go off on ego trips, which is really important. You know, what we do is for God. It's not for our own egos, for our own feeling good about ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's good to have reminders for that, because we can slip into that as humans, you know?
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Sister Joyce. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your expertise and your wisdom. You started off by saying it's been 47 years that you've been doing, engaged in spiritual direction. And that is many people whose lives that you have touched. So we're grateful. Thank you. Thank you for this time. And for all those who have heard and watched this video, blessings on you and your choices in the future. Thank you all. Bye now.
Bye.